The heavy oak doors of the library swung shut with a soft but final click, cutting off the noise from the hallway. Inside the room, the air felt different. It was cooler, smelling of old paper, polished wood, and the expensive, sharp scent of cologne. This was the heart of the Sterling estate, a place where decisions worth millions of dollars had been made over decades. But today, the decisions were over. The only thing left to do was read the will. Seated around the large mahogany table were the people who had expected to be there since the day they were born. Arthur's eldest son sat at the head of the table, even though it wasn't his chair yet. He was checking his gold watch, his leg bouncing with impatience. Across from him, his younger sister was staring at her reflection in a compact mirror, fixing her lipstick. She looked bored, as if waiting for a bus rather than hearing the last wishes of her father. The other chairs were filled with businessmen, lawyers in sharp suits, and a few distant cousins who always appeared when free food or money was involved. The room hummed with a low energy of entitlement. They weren't sad. They were hungry. They were like vultures, circling, waiting for the lawyer to say the words that would unlock the vault. Then the side door opened. The chatter in the room didn't stop, but it dipped for a second, like a needle skipping on a record. Alina walked in. She didn't look like she belonged in a painting of rich people. She wore a simple beige cardigan that had seen better days and a long dark skirt that flowed loosely around her legs. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun, and she carried a large, worn leather handbag that looked heavy. She didn't wear any diamonds. She didn't wear a watch. Her shoes were practical flats, made for walking, not for shining under crystal chandeliers. As she stepped into the room, the eyes of the people at the table slid over her. They didn't see a person. They saw a piece of furniture that had moved. The brother didn't stand up. The sister didn't put down her mirror. One of the businessmen leaned over and whispered something to his neighbor, and they both let out a short, disrespectful laugh. Alina didn't look at them. Her face was calm, smooth like a river stone. She moved to the back of the room, away from the expensive mahogany table. There was a small wooden chair set against the bookshelf, clearly meant for someone who wasn't important. She sat down, placed her bag on her lap, and folded her hands over it. She sat straight, her eyes fixed on the lawyer standing at the front. To the people in the front row, she was invisible. They knew her, of course. They had seen her walking the grounds of the estate for 30 years. They had seen her pruning the roses in the garden or sitting on the porch with Arthur, drinking tea while he talked and she listened. To them, she was the help. Maybe a housekeeper who had stayed too long, or a distant relative who had nowhere else to go. They had never bothered to learn the truth. They had never asked her what she did for Arthur, because they assumed they already knew. They thought she was just the simple woman who brought him soup and dusted the books. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson, adjusted his glasses. He looked tired. He looked around the room at the expectant faces, and then just for a moment, his eyes softened as they landed on Alina in the back corner. It was a tiny glance, but if anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen the respect in it. But no one was watching. They were all too busy thinking about themselves. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dry. The brother tapped his pen on the table. "Let's get on with it, Henderson. We have a board meeting in the city in an hour." Few people snickered. The sister snapped her compact shut. Mr. Henderson ignored the impatience. He picked up a thick document. The room seemed to lean forward. The air got tighter. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The old man was gone, and now they were going to carve up the kingdom like a Thanksgiving turkey. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Arthur Sterling," the lawyer began. He started reading the legal jargon, the standard words about debts and taxes. The brother rolled his eyes. The sister picked at her fingernails. But then, Henderson started listing the assets. "Bowed out to my son." Robert, the lawyer, read, "I leave the controlling shares of Sterling Shipping." "And the estate in the Hamptons?" Robert let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. A smug smile spread across his face. He didn't look relieved. He looked vindicated. He sat up straighter, puffing out his chest, already acting like the king of the castle. "To my daughter Victoria," Henderson continued, "I leave the penthouse apartment in Manhattan, the art collection. In the villa in the south of France? Victoria nodded. It wasn't a surprise. It was exactly what she deserved in her mind. She looked at her nails, wondering if the polish matched the interior of the French villa. The room relaxed. The atmosphere changed from tense to celebratory. The distant cousins started whispering about their own smaller payouts, calculating how much money they would have by the end of the day. The businessmen were already looking at Robert, thinking about the deals they could make now that he was in charge. The sound of ice clinking in glasses filled the silence as people took sips of their water. Celebrating their victory, they felt safe. They felt powerful. And in the back of the room, the simple woman in the beige cardigan just sat there watching them. She didn't smile, and she didn't frown. She watched Robert preen like a peacock. She watched Victoria admire her ring. She saw the greed dripping off them like rain off a roof. It was a familiar sight to her. She had watched Arthur deal with people like this his whole life. That was why, in the end, he had chosen to spend his last afternoons with her, sitting in the garden. Talking about things that mattered more than money, nobody noticed that the lawyer hadn't finished. Nobody noticed that the most important part of the document was still hidden under the lawyer's hand. They were too busy counting their chickens before they hatched. They assumed the game was over. They assumed that because Alina was sitting on a hard wooden chair in the corner, she was just a spectator to their victory. The sun was beginning to set outside the tall windows. Long shadows stretched across the room, reaching toward the mahogany table. The shadows touched the expensive suits and the silk dresses, but the darkest shadow fell in the corner where Alina sat. She was almost swallowed by it, a quiet ghost in a room full of noise. Robert leaned back, draping his arm over the empty chair next to him. "Well," he said loudly, interrupting the lawyer's drone, "that seems to be everything important. If you could just speed up the rest, Henderson, we'd like to get going." The lawyer stopped talking. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them again, he didn't look at Robert. He looked past him, past the table, past the money, and looked directly at the quiet woman in the back. "No, Robert," Mr. Henderson said softly. "That is not everything." The room went quiet again. The laughter stopped. Victoria looked up, sensing a shift in the air. Alina shifted slightly in her chair, her hands tightening on her bag. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just about to begin. Asterisk, the silence in the room didn't last long. It was broken by the sound of a leather creaking as Robert shifted his weight in his chair. He let out a sharp, impatient sigh, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling as if asking the heavens for patience. He didn't like being told no, especially not by a lawyer he viewed as an employee of his father's, and now, by extension, his employee. "What do you mean? That's not everything?" Robert asked, his voice loud and echoing off the bookshelves. "You read the shipping company. You read the houses. You read the stocks. What else is there? The furniture? The cars? Just make a list and give it to Victoria. She likes that kind of clutter." Victoria let out a high-pitched, dismissive laugh. She waved a hand in the air, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Oh, just let the staff take the furniture, Robert. Most of it is dreadfully old-fashioned. I'm going to modernize the penthouse the moment I get the keys. I don't want dusty old sofas that smell like cigars and mothballs." A few of the businessmen around the table chuckled politely. They wanted to stay on Robert's good side. The cousins in the back row nodded eagerly, hoping that letting the staff take the furniture might mean they could grab a few expensive antiques for themselves on their way out. The greed in the room was shifting from a hunger for the big prizes to a scavenging for the scraps. But it was greed all the same. The air in the room felt stuffy and hot, filled with the smell of expensive perfume and self-satisfaction. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, didn't smile. He didn't join in the laughter. He simply stood behind his desk, looking down at the document with a neutral expression. He had been with Arthur Sterling for 40 years. He had seen the children grow up, and he knew exactly what kind of people they were. He had watched them ignore their father at birthdays, show up only when they needed money, and treat the staff like dirt. He knew what was coming in the will, and part of him seemed to be preparing for the explosion that was about to happen. "Please, Robert," Mr. Henderson said, his voice calm but firm. There are specific clauses regarding the liquid assets and the management of the trust that we must address before anyone leaves. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He steepled his fingers, looking more annoyed than concerned. Fine, read the clauses. If it's about the taxes, handle it. If it's about the management, well, I'm the CEO now, aren't I? I'll handle it. The lawyer nodded slowly. He turned the page of the will. The paper made a crisp sound in the quiet room. He adjusted his glasses and began to read, but his tone was different now. It was slower. More deliberate, is my wish, Henderson read, quoting the dead man's words. That the entirety of the sterling liquid assets, the cash reserves, the offshore accounts, and the private gold vault be placed into a living trust. This trust is not to be distributed as a lump sum. Instead, it will serve as the operating capital for the family's future. Robert frowned. Operating capital? That's just business talk. It's my money. Furthermore, Henderson continued, his voice rising slightly to drown out Robert's muttering, this trust is to be controlled by a single executor. This executor will have the final say on all disbursements from the trust. No money can be accessed, sold, or moved without this person's explicit signature and approval. The room seemed to freeze. Robert's smile faltered. He sat up straighter, the smug look sliding off his face. Executor, he repeated. You appointed an executor. Who is it? You? The question hung in the air. The cousins stopped whispering. The businessmen stopped checking their phones. Everyone looked at Mr. Henderson. It made sense to them. The lawyer was the safe choice. He was boring and predictable. If Henderson was in charge, Robert could probably bully him or bribe him eventually. Mr. Henderson shook his head slowly. No, Robert. I am not the executor. Arthur knew that I would be retiring soon. He wanted someone younger, someone sharper, someone who understands the true value of this family better than anyone else. Then who? Victoria demanded, her voice shrill. She didn't like the idea of anyone standing between her and her money. One of the business partners? Is it that man from the bank? I don't trust him. He's not a business partner, Henderson said. He paused for a long moment. He looked down at his papers, then up at the family, and finally his eyes traveled past them, over their shoulders. To the dark corner of the room, the lawyer turned his body slightly, facing the back. Arthur left very specific instructions. He wrote, My children have the vision of peacocks, but they lack the wisdom of owls. They spend what they do not understand. Therefore, I leave the key to the vault to the one person who never asked me for a dime, but gave me everything I needed when I was alone. Robert twisted in his chair to see who the lawyer was looking at. Victoria turned around. The entire room shifted. The eyes of the wealthy and powerful following the lawyer's gaze in the shadowy back corner. Bathed in the fading light of the sunset sat Alina. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting on the hard wooden chair, her hands resting on her worn handbag. Her face was as calm as a pond in the morning. She didn't look scared or surprised. She just looked back at the lawyer, waiting. For a second, nobody said anything. The connection didn't register in their brains. They looked at Alina, then they looked back at the lawyer, confused. Her? Robert asked, letting out a snort of disbelief. He pointed a finger at the woman in the beige cardigan. You can't be serious. You're letting the cleaning lady control the money? Is this some kind of joke? Victoria laughed a nervous, ugly sound. Daddy must have been senile when he wrote that. She's just Alina. She lives in the cottage. She gardens. She doesn't know anything about trusts or millions of dollars. Mr. Henderson didn't laugh. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. It was sealed with red wax. He held it up for everyone to see. This envelope contains the access codes to the main accounts and the location of the physical assets, Henderson explained. And according to this will, this envelope belongs to Alina. He walked out from behind the desk. He didn't walk toward Robert or Victoria. He walked to the back of the room. The crowd of wealthy heirs parted like the Red Sea, watching him with their mouths open. They couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like a surreal dream. The lawyer, the man they thought was on their side, was walking toward the help. Henderson stopped in front of Elena. He held out the envelope. "Elena," he said gently, "Arthur told me you would know what to do with this." Elena stood up. She was not a tall woman, and next to the expensive suits and flashy dresses, she looked very small. But as she stood, the room seemed to get very quiet. She reached out and took the envelope. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She didn't look at the envelope. She looked over Henderson's shoulder, straight at Robert and Victoria. Robert's face was turning red. A vein was throbbing in his temple. He pushed his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You can't give it to her. She doesn't have the education. She doesn't have the breeding. Give it here, Elena." He took a step toward her, his hand out, palm up. He expected her to be scared. He expected her to hand it over, to apologize, to shrink away into the shadows. That was what she had done for 30 years. That was what simple women did when powerful men yelled. But Elena didn't move. She clutched the envelope to her chest, right over her heart. She looked at Robert, and for the first time, the people in the room saw something in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something else. It was steel. It was the look of a mother bear protecting her cubs, or a general guarding a fortress. "Robert," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried clearly across the library. "Sit down." Robert froze. He had never heard her speak to him like that. No one had ever spoken to him like that. "This is not yours," Elena continued, her tone level and natural. "It never was. You just thought it was." Asterisk, the command hung in the air like smoke. "Sit down." For a moment, nobody moved. The library was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. It was a heavy, rhythmic sound, counting down the seconds of the standoff. Robert looked at his hand, then back at Elena. His face was twisted in confusion that was quickly turning into anger. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not by a woman who wore a cardigan that had been mended at the elbow. "You're joking," Robert said, his voice low and dangerous. He didn't sit. Instead, he took another step forward, invading the space that Mr. Henderson had created around Elena. "This is a mistake. It has to be." "Henderson, have you lost your mind? You're handing the keys to the kingdom to a gardener?" Mr. Henderson didn't back down. He stepped between Robert and Elena, acting as a shield. He was an old man, physically much weaker than Robert, but he had the weight of the law on his side. "I haven't lost anything, Robert," Henderson said calmly. "I am reading the document as it was written by your father. And the document is very specific. The trust is conditional." "Conditional on what?" Victoria shrieked from her chair. She stood up too, knocking her purse onto the floor. She didn't bother to pick it up. "On us being nice to the help? Because if that's the game, I'm not playing it. I'm calling my lawyer. I'm going to contest this. I'll drag this through court for 10 years if I have to." "Sit down, Victoria," Elena said again. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. She just said it with the same calm certainty she used when telling a plant not to wilt. Victoria's mouth snapped shut. She looked terrified. It wasn't the kind of terror you feel in a dark alley. It was the confusion of a person who realizes the floor they are standing on has turned into glass. She sat down slowly, her eyes never leaving Elena. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He looked tired, but there was a hint of steel in his eyes now. He turned to face the room, addressing everyone, but mostly speaking to the two greedy siblings. "You should both listen to her," Henderson advised, "because the conditions of this trust are absolute. Let me read the relevant section, since you seem to have missed the point." We picked up the will again. His finger tracing the lines of text. "The trust shall remain locked and inaccessible," Henderson read, "unless the bearer of the golden key presents said key and unlocks the main accounts. Furthermore, the bearer holds full veto power over any board decisions made by the beneficiaries. If the beneficiaries attempt to bypass the bearer, or if they attempt to remove her from her position, the trust dissolves immediately." Robert blinked. "Dissolves? What does that mean?" "It means," Henderson explained slowly, as if he were speaking to a child, that if you try to fire Alina, or if you go to court to get her removed, the money disappears. Every cent of it. That's impossible, Robert sputtered. Where does it go? Arthur was very specific about that, too, Henderson said. He flipped a page. In the event of a contest or a bypass, the entire value of the trust, over $500 million, shall be donated immediately to the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Global Green Energy Fund. Robert and you, Victoria, will receive nothing. Not a penny. The silence that followed was deafening. The cousins in the back row gasped. One of the businessmen actually dropped his phone. Robert's face turned a shade of pale white that looked ghostly against his dark suit. All the air went out of his sails. He couldn't bully a donation. He couldn't sue $500 million that was already promised to polar bears and solar panels. He slumped back into his chair, looking defeated. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the biggest shark in the water. He was just a fish who had been hooked. So, she holds the keys? Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. That simple woman? She controls whether we eat or starve. She controls the company, Henderson corrected. And the cash, and the houses. Everything is in the trust. The shipping company you wanted so badly, Robert? It's owned by the trust. If Alina doesn't sign the paychecks, the ships don't sail. Robert stared at Alina with pure hatred. He looked at her worn shoes and her simple hair. He hated her because she had what he wanted, and he knew he couldn't take it from her. He was trapped in a cage of his father's making. Alina stood there, holding the envelope. She didn't look like a tyrant. She didn't look like she was enjoying their pain. She looked sad. It was the kind of deep, quiet sadness that comes from seeing people you have known for years reveal their true colors. She had cooked for these people. She had bandaged their scraped knees when they were children. She had listened to them laugh and play. And now she was seeing that the love she thought they had was fake. It was all just a mask for greed. It doesn't have to be this way, Alina said softly. Her voice was gentle, contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. Your father didn't want to hurt you. He wanted to wake you up. He had a funny way of showing it, Robert muttered, crossing his arms like a pouting child. He tried to teach you, Alina said, taking a step toward the table. The relatives leaned away, intimidated by her presence. He tried to show you that value comes from hard work, not from a bank account. You didn't listen. You only heard the numbers. So, he left the numbers to someone who understands that money is a tool, not a toy. She opened her handbag then. It was a simple gesture, but the room watched as if she were pulling out a gun. She placed the sealed envelope Henderson had given her inside the bag and snapped it shut. Then she reached into a side pocket and pulled out a small bundle of keys. They jingled softly in the quiet room. They were attached to a plain silver ring. They looked like ordinary keys for a garden shed, a back door, a pantry. Is that it? Victoria asked, her eyes wide. Is that the golden key? Alina looked at the keys in her hand. Some of them, she said. Your father gave me these years ago. He gave me the key to the wine cellar, the key to the library, and the key to his private desk. He said he trusted me with his life. Now, I suppose he was trusting me with his legacy. She turned to Mr. Henderson. Is there anything else to read? No, Alina Henderson said, closing the heavy folder. That is the essence of it. The rest is just legal details. Good, she said. She nodded to the room, a simple gesture of dismissal. Then I am going home. I have tomatoes that need watering. You can't leave, Robert shouted, panic rising in his throat. You can't just walk out with the keys. We have a payroll to meet on Friday. We have bills. Alina paused at the door. She turned back, looking at the man who was technically her boss, but who was actually powerless. Then I suggest you start working, Robert, she said. Because the days of sitting back and watching the money roll in are over. If you want the company to run, you're going to have to run it. And you're going to have to ask me for the money to pay the bills. And before I give it to you, you're going to have to explain to me why you need it. She pushed the heavy door open. The light from the hallway spilled in, cutting a path through the gloom of the library. I'll be in the cottage at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Alina added. Don't be late. I don't like to wait. With that, she walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, inside the library. The heirs were left with the silence, the ticking clock, and the crushing realization that their lives had just changed forever. They weren't kings and queens anymore. They were employees. The boss was the woman they had ignored for 30 years. The morning sun was bright and harsh, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air around the small cottage. It was a modest building, tucked away behind a wall of overgrown hedges. For years, the only people who visited this cottage were the delivery drivers and occasionally Arthur, hiding away from the noise of his big house. Today, however, the driveway was crowded with black luxury sedans. Robert stepped out of the back seat of the largest car. He looked terrible. He hadn't slept well. His eyes were red, and his expensive tie was knotted loosely around his neck, as if he had put it on in the dark. He was followed by Victoria, who was wearing huge sunglasses to hide her eyes, and a team of 3 sharp-looking lawyers in suits that cost more than the cottage itself. They looked out of place standing on the gravel path. The cottage looked small and fragile next to them, like a dollhouse surrounded by giants. The air smelled of lavender and baking bread, a stark contrast to the cologne and exhaust fumes the group had brought with them. Robert knocked on the door. He didn't wait. He knocked again, harder, using the heavy brass knocker. There was no answer. He checked his watch. It was 7:58 a.m. He gritted his teeth. He hated being the one waiting. She's doing this on purpose, he grumbled, kicking a stray pebble. She's trying to assert dominance. It's a power play. Maybe she's just busy, one of the lawyers suggested cautiously. She does live here, Robert. She might be eating breakfast. I don't care if she's eating, Robert snapped. She works for us now. Sort of. At exactly 8 a.m., the door opened. Alina stood there. She was wearing a different cardigan. This one, a soft blue, and a floral apron was tied around her waist. She didn't look like a woman holding the fate of $1 million empire. She looked like a grandmother about to offer you a cookie, but her eyes were clear and alert. You're early, she said simply. She didn't invite them in. She stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. Robert puffed out his chest, trying to regain his composure. We are here for the books, Alina. We need the access codes. We have a board meeting at noon, and payroll needs to be processed by 2 o'clock. If the employees don't get paid, the unions will start screaming. You don't want that mess on your first day. Alina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the lawyers, who were holding briefcases and looking at their shoes. First of all, Alina said, her voice mild but carrying weight, I am not Alina to you today. I am the executor of the trust. And second, I am not going to give you the codes. The lawyer's head snapped up. Victoria lowered her sunglasses. What did you say? Robert stepped forward, looming over her. You read the will. The company belongs to the trust, and we run the company. If we can't move the money, the company stops. Do you want to bankrupt your father's legacy? I said I won't give you the codes, Alina repeated calmly. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. I am going to give you a ledger. She handed the paper to Robert. Robert snatched it from her hand. He expected to see numbers, account balances, routing codes. Instead, he saw a handwritten list. It was messy and scribbled in blue ink. It read things like, fix the roof on the warehouse. Ask the night shift about the safety lights. The machine in Sector 4 is making a funny noise. What is this garbage? Robert crumpled the paper in his fist. This is a shopping list. It is a list of the things your father was worried about before he died, Alina said. Those are the things that actually keep the business running. Not the money. The machines. The people. The roof. Arthur knew you boys in the boardroom like to look at spreadsheets, but you forget to look at the factory floor. Robert threw the paper on the ground. I don't have time for riddles. I want the codes. No, Alina said. You have to. Victoria shrieked. It's the law. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer from the library, stepped out from behind the hedge, where he had been waiting quietly. He held his briefcase firmly. Actually, she doesn't have to, Henderson said gently. He looked at the expensive lawyers with a pitying expression. Arthur added a failsafe. The codes are just numbers. Anyone can type them. But the money requires authorization. And Alina is the authorizer. And she will not authorize a single cent until you prove you know where the money is going. Robert looked from the old lawyer to the simple woman in the doorway. He felt trapped. He felt like a tiger in a cage, but the cage was made of nothing but air and his own ignorance. How do I prove it? Robert asked, his voice shaking with rage. Come inside, Alina said. She finally stepped back and opened the door wide. The inside of the cottage was cozy and cluttered. There were books everywhere, stacks of them on the floor, on the tables, and filling the shelves. But they weren't novels. They were thick, heavy textbooks. Advanced macroeconomics, global logistics, structural engineering, corporate law. Some were so old the spines were cracked. Some were new, with fresh bookmarks sticking out. Robert stopped in the middle of the room. He looked around, confused. You read these? I studied them, Alina corrected him. She walked over to a small desk by the window where a computer sat. It was an old machine, but it looked well used. While you and Victoria were at galas and parties, Arthur and I would sit here. He would teach me. I didn't just cook his dinner, Robert. I balanced his books. I checked his math. When he was confused about a new regulation, I researched it for him. She pulled a stack of leather-bound journals from a shelf and dropped them on the table with a heavy thud. They looked like diaries. Your father wasn't a genius at math, Alina said, opening one of the books. It was filled with charts and calculations. He was a genius at ideas. But someone had to make sure the ideas didn't sink the ship. That was me. For 20 years, I was the one who made sure the numbers added up at the end of the night. Victoria picked up one of the journals, her hands trembling. She opened it to a random page and saw her father's handwriting. Next to Elena's neat, precise notes correcting a profit projection. She looked at the date. It was from 10 years ago. I don't understand, Victoria whispered. If you were so smart, why did you stay in the cottage? Why did you serve us tea? Because I loved him, Alina said simply. And because this work gave me a quiet life, I didn't need the penthouse. I didn't need the fancy cars. I just needed the garden and the puzzles. Arthur tried to pay me $1 million a year once. I refused. I told him to put it in the trust for a rainy day. She looked at them both, and her expression softened just a little. He knew you would squander it. He knew you would sell the company to the first bidder who offered you a quick payout. He wanted the business to survive. So he left it to the one person who actually knows how the business works. Robert sat down heavily in a small armchair. He felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. He realized that for his entire life, he had been underestimating the quiet woman in the background. He had been playing a game of checkers while she had been playing chess. So, Robert said quietly, his voice defeated. What happens now? Now, Alina said, sitting down in her chair at the desk, we go to work. You have a board meeting at noon. I'm driving. You're what? Robert asked. I'm driving, Alina repeated, picking up her car keys from the desk. I'm the executor. And I want to see what these board members of yours actually do all day. If you want the payroll money, you're going to introduce me to the people who run the machines. She stood up, smoothing her apron. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The powerful siblings were standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, looking like scolded children, while the woman in the apron was the one giving the orders. Well, Alina asked, walking toward the door. Are we going, or do you want to explain to the unions why there is no money? Robert stood up. He straightened his tie. He looked at Victoria, who looked back at him with a mix of fear and confusion. For the first time in their lives, they didn't know what to do. They had to follow the simple woman. She was the only one who knew the way. Asterisk, the drive to the city was the quietest car ride Robert had ever experienced. He sat in the back seat of his own town car, but he wasn't driving. Alina was in the front seat, beside the chauffeur, looking out the window with a sense of calm purpose. Victoria sat next to Robert, staring at her hands, too nervous to even check her phone when they arrived at the Sterling Tower. The building that had been their father's pride and joy, the staff didn't know what to think. They saw Robert and Victoria get out of the car, which was normal. But then they saw Alina step out. She was wearing her simple blue cardigan and sensible shoes. The doorman hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle, unsure if he should stop her or let her pass. Robert saw the hesitation and felt a fresh wave of shame. He realized that for years he had trained these people to think that anyone who looked like Alina didn't belong. "It's all right," Robert said to the doorman, his voice lacking its usual bark. "She's with me. She's in charge." The elevator ride to the top floor felt like it took an eternity. When the doors slid open, the boardroom was already full. The men and women who ran the daily operations of the company were sitting around the long glass table. They looked impressive in their tailored suits, holding cups of coffee and discussing the market. But when the family walked in, the room went silent. They all knew about the will. News traveled fast in the city. They had heard rumors that the staff had taken over, but seeing it with their own eyes was different. Alina walked in first. She didn't head for the seat at the head of the table. That seat, the big leather throne where Arthur used to sit, remained empty. Instead, Alina pulled a simple wooden chair from the side of the room and placed it at the very end of the table. Right in the center, Robert and Victoria sat in their usual spots. The rest of the board members looked at Alina with a mixture of curiosity and arrogance. One of the senior executives, a man named Mr. Sterling, who was no relation but had always acted like he owned the place, cleared his throat. "Look," Mr. Sterling said, leaning back in his chair and smiling tightly, "we know there is a situation with the will, and we respect the legal process. But we have a business to run. The quarterly numbers are due on Friday, and the investors are getting nervous. If we don't finalize the merger with the tech company, the stock is going to drop." Robert nodded eagerly. He was desperate to get back to business as usual. "Yes, exactly. Just sign the papers, Alina, and we can get back to work. We need the liquidity." Alina opened her bag and took out a thick folder. It wasn't the folder Mr. Henderson had given her at the will reading. It was one of the old leather journals she had shown them at the cottage. She placed it on the glass table. "The merger," Alina said softly. "You're talking about buying TechFlow Systems for $40 million? $45 million, the executive corrected smoothly. $45 million, Alina repeated. She didn't open the folder yet. She looked around the room at every single face. "Do you know what TechFlow actually does?" "They manufacture microchips," the executive said dismissively. "It's a strategic acquisition. It diversifies our portfolio," Alina said. Her voice was quiet, but the authority in it made the executive stop talking. "TechFlow manufactures a specific type of sensor that is becoming obsolete. New technology released last month makes their sensors useless. Their stock is about to crash. If we buy them for $45 million, we are buying trash." The executive laughed nervously. He looked at Robert for support. "Where did you hear that?" "The financial reports say they are a strong buy." "I heard it from the engineers," Alina said. "The same engineers who work in your basement, who have been trying to tell you for 6 months that the new sensors won't fit our machines. But you never talked to them, did you? You just looked at the projections." She opened her journal and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a hand-drawn chart showing the decline of the sensor technology and the rise of the new competitor. "This is why your father never trusted you with the checkbook," Alina said, looking at Robert but speaking to the whole room. "You buy things that shine. You don't buy things that work." Robert stared at the chart. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had almost signed that deal. He would have bankrupted the company. He looked at Alina with new eyes. He saw the woman who had brought him soup when he was sick, the woman who he thought was just a background character in his movie, and he realized she had been the director all along. "What do we do?" Robert whispered. "We don't buy them," Alina said. "We fire the advisor who recommended them." She pointed at the executive who had been pushing the deal. "And we promote the head engineer from the basement to the advisory board." The room erupted in gasps. The executive turned red. "You can't be serious. You can't just walk in here and I can't, Elena interrupted him. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope Mr. Henderson had given her. She held it up. This is the key to the trust. Every penny this company has is behind this door, and I am the only one with the key. If you want to keep your jobs, if you want this company to survive, you will listen to me. She looked at Victoria. And you. You wanted the penthouse in the city? You can have it. But the maintenance fees come out of your personal allowance, not the company account. And you will pay back the money you spent on the renovations last month? It was unauthorized. Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but she saw the look in Elena's eyes and swallowed her words. Yes, Elena, she whispered. Elena stood up. The power in the room had shifted completely. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about competence. The board members, the ones who actually cared about the company, were nodding. They could see that Elena knew what she was doing. She wasn't just a guardian of the money. She was a guardian of the legacy. Arthur didn't leave me this money to punish you, Elena said, her voice softening. He left it to me because he loved you. He knew that if you got all that money at once, you would destroy yourselves. Wealth is a tool, children. It can build a hospital, or it can buy a drug that kills you. She looked at Robert, and for a second, she looked like the mother he had never really had. I will run the trust, Elena said. I will sign the checks. But I want you two to come to the office every day. Not as the bosses, but as students. I want you to learn the business from the ground up. I want you to talk to the workers in the factory. I want you to understand what every dollar actually represents. Robert sat back in his chair. He looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, the king's chair. He realized now that he wasn't ready to sit there. He wasn't even ready to sit in the seat he was in. He had a lot of learning to do, Robert said. It wasn't a surrender. It was a beginning, Elena agreed. She packed her bag. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a garden to get back to. I'll be back tomorrow at 9 to review the payroll. She turned and walked out of the boardroom. The click of her sensible shoes on the marble floor echoed loudly. She didn't walk like a servant anymore. She walked like a woman who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, but who was strong enough to carry it. Robert and Victoria watched her go. Then they looked at each other. For the first time in their lives, they didn't talk about money. They didn't talk about what they could buy. I guess I better find out what an engineer does, Robert said quietly. Yeah, Victoria replied, picking up the chart Elena had left on the table. I guess I have a lot of reading to do. The simple woman had taught them the most valuable lesson of all. You can inherit a fortune, but you have to earn the respect to keep it. As the city bustled below them, unknown to the world, a new era had begun. And it was all thanks to the woman they had almost ignored.